The Memory of Love, Chapter 8. Adrian and Elias Cole meet each week at the same hour. Around them, the hospital is in constant motion, day and night. Adrian finds he has to think when writing up his notes consciously of the day and date to count forward from the moment of his arrival. Even the month he forgets. In England, the days would have begun tentatively to reach out with silver fingers in each direction. Here, the patterns of the sky elude him. Red sky at night, shepherd's delight. Red sky in the morning, shepherd's warning. But what is one to make of a violet sunset or a white evening sun? The one thing of which he is certain is that it is getting hotter. Instead of becoming used to the heat, he is ever more tormented by it. Adrian is still in the occasional habit of bringing something to each session. Once it was a novel, Huxley's Antique Hay, from the collection in his rooms, a newspaper bought from a roadside vendor, 2 thin leaves of dense, smudged text, a radio. He forgets the man's feelings about music. In time, he removes it. There are days when he must attend the ministry to sort out his papers. The labor office is located on the 6th floor of a building without electricity, and consequently, no working lift. So far, it has taken him several visits on the different days to obtain the appropriate forms, establish who is the person who will process them. The man in question possesses a huge, shining, bald head, is dressed always in a dark blue safari-style suit, and is never to be found in his office. Often he finds him sitting in the corridor talking with others of his kind, chewing matchsticks or cola nuts, and watching people like Adrian come and go. Thursday, Adrian arrives back at the hospital exhausted and yet full of nervous energy. He sits down by the old man's bed. Elias Cole turns and watches him, but does not speak. Together, they inhabit the amniotic stillness of the room, silent save for the old man's breathing, the muted sounds from outside. His private clients in England, from the moment they left the room, they ceased to exist. He did not allow their lives to spill into his. Here it is different. From the moment he enters the old man's room, it is his own, Adrian's life outside that seems remote and unreal. His life in England even more so. Exams had begun. The campus was quiet. Behind the windows, rows of students, heads bent, dressed in the obligatory black trousers or skirts and white shirts, along with the other staff members. I took my turn invigilating. I enjoyed the peace, walking the aisles, handing out extra paper, warning the passing of another hour. In those periods of enforced idleness, I thought often of Sophia, the smooth mask of her beauty in response, the rapid succession of her expressions as she listened to a story. At such times, her face had an extraordinary mobility. She was not much given to talking, a listener by nature and by marriage. Julius and Sophia were like the sun and the moon. Everything revolved around Julius, or he behaved as though it did. You were drawn into his orbit, but Sophia was the moon, emanating her own clear magnetic energy, the one to whom all our stories were told. Though when Sophia had something to say, it's true she didn't hesitate to speak her mind, which was a sufficiently unusual quality in a woman that I was unused to it. She chided me once for my languor. It was during one of their Sunday night suppers. We were discussing the price of commodities of rice. It was a subject I knew little about, but Sophia was full of stirring opinions. She felt an affinity with the farmers, you know. I must have been slow to respond because she berated me for being too comfortable. She said, like a cat with its own place by the fire. A married woman. Now, when I think of it, I wonder if that isn't where the answer lay. It gave her a confidence other women lacked, or better say, could not afford. Women in those days accorded more readily with what was expected of them. This seemed less true of Sophia. Julius gave her everything. Those evenings we spent at their house, Ade, Kekura, and I, she needed nothing from us, and so we were drawn to her all the more, competing among ourselves like performing monkeys. Those days in the examples, I let our conversations run through my mind like a looped tape. I rehearsed in its entirety my last visit, when she had taken my photograph, adding a remembered detail here and there. I turned over each moment, examining it from different angles for new meanings. I wondered if she had taken the film to be developed, whether she was, at this moment, looking at my image. She had not told Julius of my visit. I felt certain, and that meant something. What possible reason could there be for her to keep the fact of it from him, but that she intended it to happen again? In this way, I indulged myself explicitly, achingly. I had never been in love before. I had no idea. Hopes building up, fragile and heavy as crystals upon a filament. I was without caution. Outside the routine of exams, I took the opportunity to pursue my efforts to see the dean. What Safia had said about my Lanka was not entirely true. I had submitted and had rejected my paper, Reflections on Changing Political Dynamics. That week, I stopped by his office and spoke to his secretary, who guarded him like the oracle of Delphi. I was apportioned a thin slot of time at the end of the day. I arrived with my arguments rehearsed and ready. The dean was a small man, dark-skinned, balding, and possessed of a quicksilver energy, with tiny hands and feet, and high round buttocks, which pitched him forward, so he appeared to approach the world at a trot. Stacked upon his desk were piles of papers, each wrapped around with a rubber band. The desk itself was a massive affair, dark wood with the high gloss of the reproduction, and surface of which was inlaid with green leather with a border of tooled gold. A green onyx paperweight and a pen in a matching stand, and ivory letter opener and a brass nameplate, similar to the one on the door. Behind the dean's chair on a stand stood a massive globe of the world. Typus orbis terrarum, scripted above the Tropic of Cancer. A ship scurried across the line of the equator to Africa, hastened by a puff of wind to its sail. How is everything, Paul? I replied that everything was fine, as well as could be expected. Good, good. All to your liking? He sounded like a hotel manager. I nodded and gave a version of the same reply. Good, good. A pause. He offered me a drink. I accepted. He swiveled around in his chair and flipped open the top of the globe. Inside were several decanters, an ice bucket, tongs, highball, glasses, and tumblers. What will you have? I'll have whatever you are having, I said. Thank you. I had read somewhere ordering the same drink as your boss was a sure way to impress a tacit endorsement of their own choice. He said, as though he hadn't been listening, his back to me. I couldn't get a glimpse of his face. Tell me what you'd like. Better perhaps to be my own man. I'll have a whiskey, please. The dean occupied himself in a search, lifting and replacing decanters, inspecting the contents inscribed upon silver plates, suspended around their necks. Several were empty. He gave the impression of a child at play with a new toy. Finally, he lifted out a decanter in which an inch of gold-colored liquid swirled, removed the stopper, froze for a moment as though interrupted by a new and startling thought, shook his head slightly, replaced the stopper, and returned the decanter to the globe. "I think I'll send out for some soft drinks." I said thank you. He picked up the telephone and called the secretary, who arrived momentarily with 2 bottles on a tray, opened them and handed us one each. The dean raised a bottle to his lips and sucked reflectively at the top of. I followed suit. "How are you finding the office? Comfortable enough for you?" Again I nodded. 10 minutes had passed, and all we had covered were the pleasantries. He leaned back in his chair and the leather squeaked beneath his buttocks. I imagined his feet below the enormous desk, the tips of his shoes hovering an inch above the floor. Good, good. He placed his hands on the desk in front of him and spread his fingers. His next remark appeared to come out of nowhere. "It's a real responsibility, you know, administration." Of course, what else but to agree? "Oh, it doesn't attract the accolades of academia. You know that. I know that. And yet, great societies are built on their administrators. We are historians. It's not us who make history, nor the generals. It's the administrators. Who were the first administrators in this country? Paul?" He had been staring dreamily out of the window. Now his neck snapped back and his gaze was redirected to a spot in the center of my forehead. Before I could reply, he was wedging his finger at me in warning, as though I was about to give the wrong answer. "Not the British, though. They like to take the credit. It was the fuller, yes, cattlemen and shopkeepers. And I know, and so do you, Paul." That gimlet eye daring me to say otherwise. Once rulers of the largest empire in West Africa. I should say arguably the largest because, of course, records as such are scant. He pushed himself back into his chair. The leather sighed again as it accommodated his movements. I waited, still perplexed by his turn in the conversation. Their gift didn't lie in superior fighting skills. Those they subjugated were mostly farmers, not warriors. Their gift, their trick, and here his voice grew louder until he shouted out. Their brilliance was to leave an administrator in every town and village they passed through. Somebody to keep the local rulers in check and to make sure the right taxes were paid at the right time, all without the benefit of a filing system. Less red tape. That way, and he gave a bark like a cough. Native administration, you see. The British didn't invent it after all. But red tape, now, that really was their contribution. He barked again. Forget the politicians and the soldiers. Learn to respect the administrators. And he wagged a finger at me again, but less threateningly this time, as though to assure me of the levity of this last remark. Then he shook himself slightly. "But I don't have to tell you that. Your father was a civil servant." I nodded. In a relative frenzy of creaking, the dean swung himself out of his chair and went to the window. "You are generous with use of your office space. Excellent. I feel I made the right choice in you. Not enough space. The university was never built for so many students. Nobody stopped to consider the consequences of all these decisions when they made them, only how popular they would be." "Yes," I replied, "the only thing I had really said so far. I was beginning to wonder if we'd ever get around to the matter of my paper." I ventured. "I submitted a paper for the journal. I was wondering if we might." The dean interrupted me with a wave of his hand. Ah, yes, yes. Not really your best. I'm sorry, Paul. And space in the journal was tight. I was hoping we could discuss the particular aspects you considered problematic. Are you sure you want to discuss it? I could see the reflection of his frown in the window. Very well. You started with the wrong question. Hence, the argument was flawed from the start. He continued to stand with his back to me. I waited, but he added nothing more. Your written comments will be very welcome. He turned from the window without looking at me and resumed his seat, spreading his tiny hands out on the table again, as though inspecting his fingernails. My advice? The work it would take. You may as well start again. The General Committee are really looking for a different kind of thing. Everybody knew the General Committee and the Dean were one and the same. Now, if you were to take a look through the archives, we are lucky to have them at the university, and they are an undervalued resource in my opinion. In Europe, as you know, modern history is taken to begin at the end of the Middle Ages, not quite applicable to us here. Still, it gives one a lot of scope. And that, once I had finished my drink, was more or less where we left it. As I reached the door, he made one more remark, with perfect casualness. Dr. Kamara, from engineering, a friend of yours? Yes, I replied, though I haven't known him for long. No, he replied, of course not. Well, have a good evening. That same week, my old friend Banville Jones invited me to a party on campus. And though at first I demurred, after another night home on my own, the idea struck me as more attractive. On the Friday in question, I popped my head round his door and said I would join him. There were more parties in those days, or perhaps it just seems so to me now. No, I believe it was a time of parties. We were happy, at least we thought so, rushing headlong into the open space. The euphoria was a long time dying. We partied through the curfews, arriving late and staying until dawn, even when the curfews were over, because by then we were in that habit of it. The space was crowded by the time we arrived, the party in full swing. People spilled out onto the veranda and into the garden, moving in and out of the light and shadows. On a low table, open bottles of Johnny Walker and Bacardi, a bucket of ice. Inside, people shouted at each other above the music and laughter. In a corner next to the record player, a few couples swayed, snapping their fingers. Banville Jones plunged ahead while I stopped a yard inside the door. The atmosphere in the room was hot and sticky. Within a few moments, the sweat began to rise on my upper lip. Banville Jones and I had already left the campus for a few beers, and it's true to say I was already a little drunk by the time I arrived. I'd forgotten whose party it was. Not that it mattered. The crowd was drawn by word of mouth. Hearing about the party constituted its own invitation. I helped myself to a glass of whiskey and squeezed through the crowd until I reached the patio doors, insinuating myself into somebody else's conversation seemed like an uphill task, and I began to review my judgment in calm. I moved outside and stood with my back against the wall of the house, found myself in the glare of a light and moved away. A moth dancing around the light cast bird-sized shadows. I made my own way towards the steps, leading down to the garden. There was a weight in the air, heavy and metallic, the outline of the hills like a crouching animal, lit by distant lighting. I could see one or two people I vaguely knew, but could not be bothered to expend the energy of saying hello. I took a sip of the whiskey. A low veranda wall offered a porch. I placed my drink upon it. There was an abundance of women, and lazily I considered engaging one of them in conversation. I thought of Vanessa, of whom I had seen little since the evening of the talk of the town. My decision, she would have forgiven me, though it would have cost me the price of a new dress. Beneath the overhang of a large shrub, I thought I caught sight of Ade, the distinctive block-shaped head. Yes, it was he. And next to him, Safia. She was standing straight like a schoolgirl, holding her handbag with both hands before her, no drink, at least none that I could see. It was impossible to tell in the moment whether she had just arrived or was on the verge of departure. My heart sprang ahead of me as I moved towards them, taking careful steps to disguise my condition. Elias, she said, seeing me first of the two. Her smile was open and happy. Ade pressed a hand upon my shoulder. Hey man, I didn't know you were here, I said. I don't know why I say that. Safia was never one for small talk. I lit a cigarette. My hands shook slightly. We were talking, she said, about which one of your senses you would give up if you had to. It seems a reprise of our conversation at the talk of the town. Hearing, I said immediately, and she laughed. Yes, I believe that about you. But you won't be able to talk to people either, of course. I shrugged, sighed then, and you? Well, that's what we were just discussing. I don't seem to be able to give up any of them. Smell? I said. It could even be an advantage at a time. The smell of a flower, of the rain, of your own children. So much of taste is based on our ability to smell. So think what else you would be giving up anyway. She let the thoughts trail away. We were just being silly. How are you, Elias? I replied I was well. At that moment, Ade took the opportunity to move away and talk to another of the guests, leaving Safia in my care, an unspoken thing, as though she were a precious object that required guarding. Where is Julius tonight? He should be on his way. He let you come here alone. Irresistible to take a swipe at one's rival. Ade came with me. Oh, you know Julius. She laughed lightly and added, or maybe you don't. My husband has many strong points. Timekeeping isn't one of them. And so we stood making conversation against the barrage of noise. At other times, simply watching the people around us. I fetched her one cup and another. Of Julius, there was no sign. Next to me, I felt her shoulders drop. Rain began to fall out of the black. To avoid a soaking, we moved indoors, where even more people were crammed into the room. An argument started between two men, one of whom was Ade. In a moment, Kekura, who I had not even known was present, had waded in on the side of his friend. I believe they were discussing the situation in Nigeria, where secessionists were seeking recognition for their illegal state. Ade thought our faculty should call a strike in support of our colleagues over there. I suppose Ade might have had some Nigerian ancestry, as suggested by his name, though I have no idea which parent or even which part of that country. The energy expended between them could have defeated the National Armed Forces of Nigeria, gesticulating and pointing at the ceiling, each participant raising his voice above the other in an effort to press home their advantage. In the corner, the dancers turned up the music. I had sobered up quite a bit by then. I turned to Safia and offered to take her home. Actually, I drove myself here, she said. I could drop you off if you like. As we walked to the car, it began to rain hard. Windless, the water dropped vertically out of the sky. Safia pulled a plastic rain scarf from her bag and tied it under her chin. The rain brought forth her smell of the soil and lent a freshness to the note of jasmine in the midnight air. I remind her of our earlier conversation. As we walked, she talked about the university grounds, how they contained so many species of plants, some quite rare, others imported. She had been involved in cataloging them, collecting specimens to be dried and labeled. Inside the car, The windscreen was opaque with condensation and our breath. The wipers working furiously beyond the gates, the rain and the dark had driven people indoors, doused the oil lamps of the street sellers, cleared the rubbish and the pedestrians off the streets. She drove, leaning forward to peer through the windscreen, as though she were peering down a well. At a crossroads, we nearly missed a roadblock, and the figure of a soldier swaddled in a plastic cape appeared before us. A flashlight and a tap on the glass. Safia wound down her windows. Yes, sir. Sorry. Oh. I leaned across Safia, smiled and touched my hand. I reckoned on a night like this, he wouldn't want to bother with us. It was a matter of speaking to him in the right way. I could make out nothing of his face, just a dark shape behind the glare of the torch. I was wrong. He was having none of it. Irritated by the weight, I suppose, and the irksome nature of his duty, Safia handed over our documentation, and finding no satisfaction there, the man next wanted to search the boot. I told Safia to stay where she was and stepped out of the car. I told him I admired the job he was doing and his thoroughness. I brought out my packet of cigarettes and offered him one, as well as a little something to buy some food. It's easy when you know how no more than the seduction of a woman who desires to be seduced. Soon enough, we were on our way. In the passing light, I caught glimpses of Safia's profile as she stared ahead, her brows drawn together. After a time, she spoke. Did you give him something? Just a few cigarettes, actually. The best part of the packet. You shouldn't have. It was nothing, I shrugged. I thought she was thanking me. Minutes later, the rain eased. At the junction to my house, she pulled over. Elias, would you mind? I think maybe I should get home. Of course. It stopped raining. I'll walk from here. I stood and watched the tail lights of the car shimmer on the wet road, grow small and disappear. I felt exhilarated. At the same time, I had a sense of having somehow misstepped. I lit a cigarette from what remained of my packet, and I set off towards the bridge and home.